Keanu Reeves thought it was just another quiet afternoon, until a McDonald's stop turned into a chilling encounter that no one saw coming. A little boy's whisper set off a chain reaction, exposing something so dark it left the internet buzzing with speculation. Was Keanu caught in a conspiracy too wild to believe, or did he stumble onto a truth Hollywood won't touch? Here's where it gets weird. It started with a whisper. A small boy, no older than 5, tugged at his sleeve, his big, innocent eyes filled with something deeper. Fear. Keanu leaned down to listen, his heart stopping at the words that left the child's trembling lips. Within seconds, Keanu's face went pale. His hand reached for his phone. The air in the restaurant felt heavier. He hesitated for only a moment before dialing. 911, what's your emergency? The words caught the attention of the McDonald's crew behind the counter. A woman working near the register froze mid-motion, her eyes darting toward the little boy. She looked worried, no terrified. And then, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere, a man standing near the exit, dressed sharply in a dark suit, turned his head toward Keanu. His expression remained unreadable, but his hand moved to his pocket, pulling out his phone. He pressed it to his ear, his gaze locked onto the child. Something wasn't right. The doors to the McDonald's swung open. 2 uniformed police officers stepped in, their eyes scanning the scene. Keanu Reeves had just set something in motion. Something big, and nobody knew what would happen next. The tension inside the McDonald's was suffocating. The air felt thick, as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Keanu Reeves sat frozen, his phone still clutched in his hand, the 911 call lingering in the air. The small boy beside him, his toy car clutched tightly in his tiny fingers, barely moved. His eyes, wide with uncertainty, flickered between Keanu and the 2 police officers now entering the building. One of the officers, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. His gaze moved swiftly, assessing the situation. The moment he spotted Keanu, recognition flashed across his face, but this wasn't a moment for celebrity admiration. Keanu exhaled slowly, lowering his phone. He motioned subtly toward the boy, his expression unreadable. The officer caught the gesture and knelt to the child's level. Meanwhile, across the room, the man in the suit took a slow step back. He was still on his phone, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. His face betrayed nothing, no worry, no nervousness. Just eerie calm. The second officer, a shorter but stocky man, had already noticed him. His sharp eyes darted to the man's phone. "Sir, I need you to hang that up," he said, his voice firm but controlled. The man didn't comply immediately. Instead, he turned his body slightly, angling himself toward the door. The muscles in Keanu's back tensed. He wasn't an officer, but he had seen this kind of behavior before, in movies, in real life. It was the kind of movement a man made when he was preparing to run. The police officer stepped toward him, his tone hardening. "I said." The man hung up. The officer didn't look convinced. "Everything okay over here?" he pressed. The man in the suit offered a thin smile, his voice as smooth as silk. "Yes, officer. Just a misunderstanding." Keanu's jaw clenched. That was a lie. The officer wasn't buying it either. "Misunderstanding, huh? Then you won't mind telling me why you've been standing near the door this whole time without ordering anything." The man's lips twitched, the only sign of irritation breaking through his carefully composed mask. Meanwhile, back at the table, the boy still hadn't spoken again. The first officer gently asked for his name. The child hesitated, his small fingers fidgeting with his toy car. He looked up at Keanu, as if silently asking if it was okay to answer. Keanu nodded, his expression softening. The boy swallowed hard. Then, in the smallest voice, he whispered his name. It wasn't just any name. The moment he said it, the officer's expression changed. A flash of something, understanding, urgency, crossed his face. His posture straightened, and suddenly, he wasn't just treating this as a routine call. He exchanged a quick glance with his partner, a silent message passing between them. The officer subtly touched the radio clipped to his shoulder. "HQ, I need a name check on a missing child." First name. He never got to finish. Because at that exact moment, the man in the suit made his move. 1 second, he was standing still. The next, he bolted. He twisted sharply, shoving the officer aside and sprinting toward the door. Chaos erupted. The officer reacted instantly, lunging for him, but he was fast. Chairs toppled over. A tray crashed to the ground, scattering fries and drinks across the floor. Customers gasped, a few scrambling out of the way. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. Keanu was already on his feet. He didn't think. He just moved. The suited man was almost to the exit, but Keanu had been in enough action movies to know how to react. With adrenaline surging through his veins, he lunged forward, his hand grabbing the back of the man's jacket. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Then, with a sharp yank, Keanu pulled the man back just enough for the officer to tackle him to the ground. The impact was hard. The officer pinned him down, his knee pressed firmly into his back. "Stay down," he barked, yanking his hands behind his back. The entire restaurant had fallen into stunned silence. Keanu stepped back, his breathing heavy. He glanced toward the little boy, who was now gripping his toy car so tightly that his small knuckles had turned white. The first officer was already back on his radio, his voice urgent. "We have a positive ID on a missing child. Suspect in custody. Requesting immediate backup." A missing child. Keanu's stomach twisted. He looked back at the suited man, whose polished exterior had crumbled. The carefully maintained facade was gone. His face was pressed to the floor, his mouth twisted in frustration. And yet, there was no panic in his eyes. No fear. Just something else. Something cold. Something that made Keanu's skin crawl. The officer securing him noticed it too. "Why don't you look more nervous?" he muttered. The man didn't answer. And then his phone rang. It was still in his pocket, vibrating against the tile floor. The officer pulled it out, glancing at the screen. His face darkened. Keanu caught a glimpse of the caller ID. No name. Just a single word. Unknown. The officer let out a slow breath before slipping the phone into an evidence bag. "We're going to find out exactly who you've been talking to." The suited man finally spoke. His voice was calm. Too calm. "You won't find anything," he said simply. The words sent an eerie chill down Keanu's spine. Because he had a feeling. This wasn't over yet. The restaurant was still reeling from the chaos. Customers whispered among themselves, their eyes flickering between Keanu Reeves, the restrained man in the suit, and the terrified little boy still clutching his toy car. The officers worked quickly, securing the suspect while the officer, now gripping his confiscated phone, stared at the screen. The caller was still trying to reach him. The name on the screen remained the same. Unknown. For a tense moment, no one spoke. Then the officer swiped to decline the call, locking the phone and placing it into the evidence bag. Keanu watched the scene unfold, his hands still slightly clenched. He wasn't an investigator, but something about this whole situation felt bigger than just a random kidnapping. There was a cold calculation behind that man's stare, a disturbing lack of panic. Almost as if he expected this. The officer looked toward his partner, speaking low and firm. "We need backup. Now." The radio crackled as the request was confirmed. More units were on the way. But before they could take the suspect away, something happened that sent another ripple of unease through the McDonald's. The little boy, silent this entire time, suddenly let go of his toy car. It tumbled to the floor, spinning slightly before coming to a stop. Then, without looking up, he whispered something. At first, no one understood. The words were too soft, barely escaping his lips. The officer crouched down, gently urging him to speak up. "What did you say, buddy?" The child hesitated, glancing nervously at Keanu before his voice came out a little louder this time. "There's more." The word sent a chill through Keanu's spine. The officer blinked. "More what?" The boy hesitated again, his tiny fingers gripping the hem of his shirt as if trying to hold onto his courage. Then, with all the innocence of a child who had seen too much, he whispered, "More kids." The room felt like it had been sucked dry of air. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. The officers froze. Even the restrained man in the suit, who had remained eerily calm this whole time, stopped struggling. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Not fear. Not guilt. Annoyance. Like he had just lost something valuable. The officer's demeanor shifted immediately. "We need to move," he said, standing up quickly. "Now." He turned to the restrained man. "Where are they?" His voice was sharp, demanding. The suspect didn't answer. Keanu stepped closer. He wasn't law enforcement, but he wasn't going to just stand by. His voice was low, but it carried weight. "They're not just going to find your phone empty," he said. "They're going to trace every call, every message, every place you've been." The man turned his head slightly, his lips barely tilting into something that might have been a smirk. He wasn't afraid, and that terrified Keanu more than anything. A siren wailed from outside. Backup had arrived. 2 more squad cars pulled up in front of the McDonald's, and more officers flooded in. The customers had started recording on their phones, murmuring amongst themselves as they tried to piece together what was happening. One of the new officers approached the lead detective. "We got a hit from HQ. They ran his name through the database." He handed over a thin file. The officer flipped it open, and whatever he saw made his grip tighten around the paper. "This guy," he muttered, his face darkening. "He's been on the radar before. More than once." Keanu could see just enough of the report to make out a few words. Trafficking. Multiple aliases. International watch lists. His blood ran cold. The officer turned back to the suspect, kneeling beside him again. His patience was gone. "Where are they?" No answer. He exhaled sharply, signaling for two officers to haul the man to his feet. "We'll find out one way or another," he said. "Take him in." As the officers moved to escort the suspect out, Keanu felt a tiny tug on his sleeve. He looked down. The little boy was staring up at him, tears brimming in his wide eyes. Keanu lowered himself to the child's level, offering a reassuring smile. "You're safe now," he murmured. The boy's lips trembled. He glanced at the officers leading the man away before whispering something so quiet that Keanu barely caught it. "Not all of them." A weight settled in Keanu's chest. The boy wasn't just talking about himself. He was talking about other kids. More victims. More children who hadn't been rescued yet. Keanu turned to the officer, his voice unwavering. "We need to find them. Every single one of them." The officer nodded, his own determination sharpening. "We will." But as the man in the suit was led outside, Keanu caught a final glance at his face. The suspect's calm expression hadn't changed. He wasn't worried, and that terrified Keanu even more. Because people like that, people who operate in the shadows, in places no one ever thinks to look, always had a backup plan. And Keanu had the sickening feeling that this was far from over. The air outside the McDonald's was thick with tension as the suspect was shoved into the back of a police cruiser. The flashing red and blue lights painted eerie patterns across the dark pavement, illuminating the faces of onlookers who had gathered, their phones raised to capture every second. Keanu Reeves remained just outside the entrance, his jaw clenched, his hands flexing at his sides. His heart was still racing. The little boy's words echoed in his head. Not all of them. Inside the police cruiser, the man in the suit sat stiffly, his hands cuffed behind his back. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't shouting his innocence. He just sat there, waiting. That disturbed Keanu more than anything else. The lead officer, the taller of the two, stood nearby, speaking into his radio. His voice was calm but sharp, issuing rapid orders. "HQ, we need a deep background check on this guy. He's using an alias, but I want to know every known location he's ever been tied to. Cross-reference missing children reports." The second officer, stockier with a thick mustache, was flipping through a thin file on the suspect. His scowl deepened as he scanned the records. "This guy's got a history of disappearing. Multiple fake IDs, addresses that don't exist, businesses that pop up and vanish." Keanu took a step closer. "He's not working alone," he said, his voice steady but firm. The taller officer nodded grimly. "No, he's not." Keanu's gaze flickered back to the little boy, who was now sitting on the McDonald's curb, clutching his toy car. He looked small, too small for the weight of whatever he had just escaped. Keanu crouched down beside him. The boy's wide eyes met his. "Can you tell us anything else?" Keanu asked gently. The boy hesitated. Then slowly he nodded. The stocky officer approached, his notepad ready. "Go ahead, kid. Anything helps." The boy bit his lip, his fingers pressing into the plastic of his toy car. His small voice trembled, but he forced himself to speak. "It's a house," he whispered. The officers exchanged looks. Keanu's body tensed. The boy continued, his voice barely above a breath. "Big. White. With a black gate." The stocky officer was already flipping to a new page, jotting everything down. "Anything else? A number on the house? Street signs? Anything at all?" The boy's brows furrowed in concentration. Then he nodded. "There was a big tree," he said, his voice uncertain, like he wasn't sure if that was important. Keanu glanced at the officers. The taller one was already relaying the details into his radio, his voice tight. The stockier officer knelt down, keeping his tone gentle but urgent. "Kid, do you remember how many other kids were there?" A flicker of hesitation crossed the boy's face. Then his lips trembled. His next words nearly made Keanu's blood freeze. "A lot." Silence. "You felt that, didn't you?" That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like, and let's keep going. The officer nodded, his expression grave. Okay, buddy. You did good. Really good. Keanu exhaled slowly, rubbing his palms together, trying to process everything. This wasn't just one kidnapped child. This was something bigger. The suited man locked in the cruiser wasn't just a random criminal. He was part of a system, a network. Keanu clenched his jaw, and they were running out of time. The officers wasted no time. The second police cruiser had arrived with additional units, and within minutes, they were in motion. Keanu stood beside the lead officer as he gave orders. Send a unit to that address. Search all white houses with black gates in the immediate area. Check every missing child report in the last 6 months and compare them to locations this guy's been linked to. The stocky officer stepped forward. We need to bring the kid in for protective custody. We don't know who else might be looking for him. At those words, Keanu's stomach twisted. That's when he saw it. Across the street, parked just beyond the police barricade, was a black sedan. It wasn't doing anything, just idling. But the moment Keanu locked eyes with the driver, something shifted. The car pulled away. Fast. Keanu's instincts screamed at him. That car, he said quickly, pointing. Did you see that? The taller officer followed his gaze, cursing under his breath. Get a plate. Too late. The sedan had already disappeared down the street. Keanu exhaled sharply. There's more of them, he said. The officer didn't argue. Yeah, he admitted. There always are. 30 minutes later, Keanu found himself in the back of a police SUV, headed to the precinct. The little boy sat beside him, silent. The toy car still hadn't left his hands. Keanu could see the exhaustion setting in. The adrenaline was wearing off, and now, all that remained was a scared child trying to process what had just happened. Keanu leaned closer. Hey buddy, you're safe now. The boy glanced up at him, his lip trembling. Keanu hesitated, then added softly, Do you want to tell me your real name? The boy blinked, and then, for the first time since this all started, he shook his head. Keanu's heart ached. The child wasn't just scared. He didn't know his real name. Whatever had been done to him, however long he had been missing, it had stripped even that from him. Keanu clenched his fists, a new wave of determination settling in his chest. He wasn't going to let this kid slip through the cracks. And he sure as hell wasn't going to let the rest of those missing children stay hidden. He turned to the officer driving. How long until we get there? The officer glanced at him in the rearview mirror. 5 minutes. Keanu nodded. 5 minutes. Then they would start tearing this entire thing apart, piece by piece. And they wouldn't stop until every single missing child was found. The drive to the precinct was tense. The boy sat stiffly beside Keanu, his tiny fingers still gripping the toy car, as if it was his only connection to safety. The SUV's interior was quiet except for the occasional crackle of the police radio, feeding updates from units scouring the city for the black-gated house. Keanu stared out the window, his mind racing. This wasn't just one random abduction. This was something larger, something calculated. And the man in the suit, he wasn't just some low-level criminal. He was connected. The officer driving glanced at Keanu in the rearview mirror. You okay? Keanu inhaled sharply, trying to shake the heavy feeling in his chest. Not until we find the rest of those kids. The officer nodded grimly. As they pulled into the precinct parking lot, the little boy suddenly shifted in his seat. His eyes darted around anxiously, and his grip on his toy tightened. Keanu noticed immediately. Hey, it's all right, he said gently. This is a safe place. The child shook his head. His breathing quickened. Keanu's stomach twisted. The stocky officer in the passenger seat turned around, frowning. Something wrong, kid? The boy didn't answer, but Keanu could see the fear creeping into his small frame. His shoulders tensed. His wide, tired eyes darted toward the entrance of the station, where a few officers stood talking. Then the boy whispered something so softly, Keanu barely caught it. He's here. Keanu's blood ran cold. The officers immediately went on high alert. Who's here? The driver demanded. The child's hand trembled as he pointed. Keanu followed his gaze, and his breath caught. Standing just outside the precinct entrance, leaning casually against a dark-colored car, was a man. Not the same man from McDonald's. Someone else. He was well-dressed, his suit crisp, his hair neatly combed back. He looked normal, like any businessman leaving an office building. But his gaze, dark, piercing, unblinking, was locked onto the police SUV. Locked onto the child. Keanu barely had time to react before the man smirked. Then he lifted his phone, and slowly, deliberately, He took a picture of the boy through the windshield. Keanu's instincts screamed. "Go," he barked. The officer floored the gas pedal, swinging the SUV into a sharp turn toward a side entrance of the precinct. At the same moment, two officers standing outside noticed the movement and turned toward the suited man. One of them started toward him, calling out. The man didn't wait. He pocketed his phone and walked away. Not ran, not hurried, just walked, like he already knew no one could stop him. Keanu's fists clenched. He had seen that kind of confidence before, the kind that came from knowing you were untouchable. The officer slammed the brakes in front of a secured entryway, and another officer rushed out, holding the door open. Inside now, Keanu grabbed the boy's hand and bolted from the SUV, leading him into the precinct. The door slammed shut behind them, locking the chaos outside. Inside the station, the tension was thick. The lead officer, the tall one from McDonald's, was already on the phone, his voice urgent. "I want that security footage pulled. Now." Keanu stood by the boy, his pulse still hammering. He couldn't shake the image of that man's smirk. The way he had taken that picture. This wasn't just a random kidnapping ring. This was something organized. The stocky officer returned from speaking with another detective. "We checked the footage. No plates on the car. No ID match on the guy." His voice was laced with frustration. "These guys are ghosts." Keanu exhaled sharply. "They're watching us." The taller officer nodded grimly. "Yeah, and they're not worried." Keanu looked down at the boy. He was quiet, staring at the floor. "Hey buddy." Keanu crouched next to him. "Do you know who that man was?" The child didn't answer right away. Then his tiny hands gripped his toy tighter. "He talked to him," he whispered. Keanu's breath caught. "The man in the suit?" The boy nodded. "They were together." Keanu felt a sickening weight settle in his chest. Of course they were. This wasn't just one bad guy. This was an operation. And it wasn't over. Hours passed. The boy was placed in protective custody, guarded by officers who wouldn't leave his side. Keanu paced inside the precinct, his mind spinning. The house. The black gate. The tree. Somewhere out there, other kids were waiting for help. And Keanu wasn't about to sit around while they stayed missing. The tall officer approached, his expression serious. "We've sent units to every location matching the boy's description. But we need more." Keanu exhaled sharply. "Let me help." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You're a civilian." Keanu's jaw tightened. "I have resources. I know people who can track information faster than official channels." The stocky officer crossed his arms. "You're not a cop." Keanu held his gaze. "No." Then his voice dropped. "But you and I both know I don't need a badge to find these guys." A tense silence stretched between them. Then finally the taller officer nodded. Keanu grabbed his phone. If these guys thought they were untouchable, they were about to learn otherwise. The air inside the precinct was thick with tension. Officers were moving quickly, making calls, pulling records, and scanning surveillance footage, but Keanu Reeves could feel it. They were running out of time. Somewhere out there, more children were trapped. And the men responsible? They weren't scared. Keanu sat across from the little boy, who was now wrapped in a warm blanket, a cup of hot chocolate sitting untouched in front of him. His fingers traced the edges of his toy car absent-mindedly. He looked exhausted, broken, but Keanu wasn't giving up. He leaned in, his voice gentle but urgent. "I know you're scared, buddy, but if there's anything else you remember about that house, anything at all, we need to know." The boy hesitated, biting his lip. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost lost in the noise of the station, he whispered, "They had a red door." Keanu's eyes widened. The taller officer, who had been listening nearby, turned sharply toward the stockier officer. "Get on it." Cross-reference white houses with black gates and a red door. Now, the stocky officer was already moving, typing rapidly into his computer. Within moments, his eyes flickered with something lead. "I've got something," he muttered. "Abandoned estate on the outskirts of town. The owner is a shell corporation, fake name, fake business, completely off the grid." The taller officer didn't hesitate. "Let's move." Keanu stood immediately. The officer turned to him. "You're not coming with us." Keanu's jaw clenched. "The hell I'm not. This is a tactical op, not an action movie," the officer shot back. "We're going in with SWAT. It's dangerous." Keanu's voice was quiet, but firm. "And so is leaving those kids in there a second longer than they have to be." The officers exchanged a look. Then, with a reluctant sigh, the taller officer handed Keanu a bulletproof vest. "Stay behind the breach team. No heroics. Keanu nodded. But deep down he knew, if it came down to it, he wasn't going to hold back. They were getting those kids out. The convoy of unmarked police vehicles and SWAT trucks rolled down a secluded dirt road. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows along the path. The abandoned estate loomed ahead, a massive, white-brick mansion with a black iron gate. And just beyond that, a red door. Keanu's gut twisted. This was it. The lead SWAT officer's voice crackled over the radio. Positions confirmed. Stand by for breach. Keanu adjusted his vest, his pulse hammering. Then boom. A flash grenade exploded near the gate, disorienting anyone inside. Within seconds, SWAT moved in, storming the estate with military precision. Keanu followed close behind, his heart racing. Inside, chaos erupted. Men in suits, just like the one from McDonald's, scrambled in confusion. Some tried to run. Others reached for weapons. But the officers were faster. One by one, they were taken down. Keanu rushed forward, scanning the rooms. And then, he heard it. Crying. He turned a corner and saw it, a locked door. Without thinking, he slammed his shoulder against it. It didn't budge. A SWAT officer rushed over, setting a charge against the lock. Boom. The door swung open. Keanu's breath caught. Inside, at least a dozen children sat huddled together. Some were crying. Some were too weak to react. All of them looked terrified. "We got them!" Keanu shouted. "They're here!" Officers rushed in, quickly wrapping blankets around the kids, checking for injuries, lifting the youngest into their arms. Keanu knelt beside a little girl who couldn't have been older than 4. She stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. He forced a small smile. "You're safe now." She blinked once. Then slowly, she reached out and took his hand. Keanu swallowed hard. This was why he had come. For them. For all of them. By sunrise, the estate was fully secured. Every suspect was in custody. Every child was accounted for. The little boy from McDonald's, the one who had started it all, stood beside Keanu in the precinct parking lot. A social worker was speaking softly to him, explaining that he would be placed in a safe home until they found his family. But before leaving, the boy turned to Keanu. His lip trembled. Then, he took a deep breath and finally whispered his real name. Keanu smiled. "That's a great name, buddy." The boy hesitated. Then, in a move that nearly shattered Keanu's heart, he reached out and hugged him. Keanu's arms wrapped around the tiny child, his throat tightening. This was a battle won. But the war? It wasn't over. As the boy was led away, Keanu turned to the officers. "Who else is involved?" he asked. The taller officer sighed. "We're still tracking leads. But this isn't just a local operation. These guys are connected to something bigger." Keanu's jaw tightened. He had known it wouldn't be as simple as one bust. But that didn't mean he was going to walk away. "Keep me updated," he said firmly. The stocky officer raised an eyebrow. "You planning to become a detective now?" Keanu smirked. "Let's just say, I don't like unfinished business." The officers chuckled, but there was respect in their eyes. Keanu Reeves had come into this by accident. But now, he wasn't just an actor caught in the middle of something. He was in this fight for good. The story had gone viral. The headlines plastered everywhere. Keanu Reeves helps thwart child trafficking ring. But for Keanu, it wasn't about the headlines. It was about the kids. He sat in his quiet home, watching the news report. Authorities had already dismantled 2 more safe houses tied to the network. Dozens of children had been rescued. And the little boy from McDonald's? He had been reunited with his family. Keanu smiled to himself. It wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something rare. Hope. And he knew. He wasn't done yet. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel. That way you'll never miss our newest uploads.